In the early years of the Cold War, arms control proposals were framed publicly as efforts to reduce tension and limit destructive capability. Yet, from their inception, they were inseparable from intelligence competition, because verification mechanisms required states to reveal information about force structure, deployment patterns, production capacity, and testing activity that had previously been guarded with extraordinary secrecy. This structural tension meant that arms control verification did not merely accompany intelligence work, but became one of its most contested domains. As negotiators and intelligence agencies alike understood that the credibility of any agreement depended less on its written provisions than on the ability to monitor compliance under conditions of mistrust. The earliest discussions of inspection regimes exposed this paradox clearly, as one side's demand for intrusive verification was interpreted by the other not only as a safeguard against cheating, but as an opportunity for espionage under legal cover. Intelligence services quickly recognized that inspection protocols, data exchanges, and notification requirements would generate streams of information whose value extended far beyond compliance monitoring, offering insight into adversary doctrine, readiness, and technical sophistication. As a result, verification debates became arenas in which states attempted simultaneously to secure transparency and to limit exposure, embedding intelligence calculation into every clause concerning access, data format, timing, and inspection scope. The design of verification mechanisms thus reflected a dual objective: to detect violations while minimizing the intelligence advantages granted to the inspecting party, creating complex negotiation dynamics in which technical details carried strategic weight. Intelligence agencies were deeply involved in shaping these provisions, advising negotiators on what information would be most revealing, what forms of inspection would yield the greatest analytic return, and what reciprocal exposure would be acceptable. This advisory role transformed arms control talks into indirect intelligence contests, as each side sought to extract maximum informational benefit while constraining the adversary's ability to do the same. Verification proposals involving on-site inspections were particularly contentious, as they raised concerns about inspectors observing unrelated facilities, production processes, or operational practices, prompting elaborate procedures governing inspector movement, equipment use, and data recording. Remote monitoring technologies, including seismic detection for test bands and national technical means, such as reconnaissance satellites, introduced additional layers to the battlefield, as states debated whether certain collection capabilities should be acknowledged, protected, or constrained within agreements. The phrase national technical means itself emerged as a compromise, recognizing that intelligence collection through space-based and remote sensors would continue, but that interference with those systems would be prohibited, effectively legitimizing certain forms of surveillance while codifying limits on countermeasures. This institutionalization of intelligence capabilities within arms control frameworks underscored how verification became inseparable from espionage practice, blurring the line between cooperative transparency and adversarial observation. Intelligence analysts were tasked with translating negotiated provisions into operational collection plans, identifying how inspection windows, notification timelines, and data exchanges could be integrated into broader analytic models of adversary capability. The challenge lay in distinguishing genuine compliance from carefully calibrated adherence that concealed incremental advantage, requiring sustained scrutiny rather than episodic review. Early test ban discussions highlighted the technical complexity of verification, as seismic monitoring could detect underground explosions but struggled to differentiate them from natural events without corroborating data, forcing intelligence services to refine analytic techniques and to lobby for more intrusive measures. The debate over permissible thresholds, inspection rights, and data sharing formats thus became an extension of intelligence competition conducted within diplomatic forums. Military planners monitored these negotiations closely, aware that verification outcomes would influence both force planning and intelligence posture. Throughout the 1960s, as strategic arsenals expanded and technological sophistication increased, arms control verification evolved into a structured intelligence domain in which compliance assessment, deception detection, and information extraction operated simultaneously. Agreements were judged not solely on their capacity to limit weapons, but on whether their verification regimes provided sufficient visibility into adversary activity to maintain deterrent stability. Intelligence agencies developed specialized units dedicated to treaty monitoring, integrating signals intelligence, imagery analysis, human reporting, and open-source evaluation into comprehensive compliance assessments. The institutionalization of these units signaled that verification was no longer an adjunct to arms control, but a central battlefield within it, where analytical rigor and collection capability determined whether agreements enhanced security or created exploitable blind spots. By the late 1960s, it was evident that arms control verification would remain contested terrain, as every provision negotiated in the language of cooperation carried embedded intelligence consequences, ensuring that diplomacy and espionage would remain intertwined throughout the remainder of the Cold War. As the late 1960s gave way to the 1970s, arms control verification matured into a structured and highly technical intelligence arena, particularly as negotiations shifted toward limits on strategic delivery systems and anti-ballistic missile deployments, where compliance could not be assessed through single inspections, but required continuous monitoring across dispersed facilities and deployment zones. Intelligence agencies became deeply embedded in the drafting of treaty language, scrutinizing definitions of launchers, counting rules, conversion procedures, and dismantlement protocols to ensure that ambiguous terminology did not create exploitable loopholes. Every definitional dispute carried intelligence implications because how a missile, launcher, or test article was categorized determined what could be monitored and what might escape detection under treaty ceilings. Verification regimes increasingly relied on national technical means, including satellite imagery, electronic signals interception, telemetry analysis, and radar tracking, transforming routine intelligence collection into formalized compliance monitoring. Telemetry encryption, concealment practices, and masking techniques became focal points of contention as states sought to protect sensitive performance data during missile tests, while adversaries pressed for transparency sufficient to confirm declared capabilities. Intelligence services devoted substantial analytic resources to interpreting missile test telemetry, comparing declared specifications with observed performance, and identifying discrepancies that might indicate hidden capability. Arms control thus provided a recurring stream of structured data, but interpreting that data required integrating it with broader intelligence estimates to distinguish legitimate modernization from prohibited expansion. On-site inspection regimes, where negotiated, were carefully choreographed events, with host states managing access and presentation, while inspection teams sought to observe, measure, and record information without exceeding agreed boundaries. The design of inspection protocols became an intelligence contest in itself, as states negotiated camera restrictions, equipment permissions, escort rules, and perimeter limitations, each detail influencing the quantity and quality of information inspectors could gather. Intelligence agencies prepared inspection teams with detailed facility maps, production estimates, and analytic hypotheses, seeking to maximize informational gain within narrow time frames. Compliance disputes were evaluated through layered analysis, combining imagery of construction activity, production rates inferred from logistics, and signals intelligence related to command and deployment, demonstrating that verification was not a discrete act, but an ongoing analytic process. Deception and denial became persistent concerns as states considered whether adversaries might comply technically while shifting capability to unregulated categories or exploiting definitional gaps. Analysts therefore monitored not only declared systems, but parallel research and development streams that could signal strategic circumvention. The institutionalization of treaty monitoring units formalized verification as a core intelligence mission, with dedicated analysts tracking treaty-limited items, compiling longitudinal compliance reports, and advising policymakers on the credibility of agreements. Political leadership relied heavily on these assessments to sustain public and congressional support for arms control, making intelligence evaluation central to the legitimacy of diplomatic outcomes. Internal debates within intelligence communities reflected the complexity of this task, as analysts weighed ambiguous indicators and resisted pressure to declare compliance or violation without sufficient corroboration. Verification became a battlefield precisely because it demanded judgments under incomplete information, where technical data could be interpreted in multiple ways and where premature conclusions carried diplomatic consequences. Arms control negotiations increasingly included mechanisms for consultative commissions and data exchanges, institutionalizing structured dialogue over compliance disputes. Yet these forums themselves became arenas of intelligence maneuver, as states tested each other's evidentiary thresholds and analytic confidence. By the mid-1970s, it was clear that arms control verification did not diminish intelligence competition, but reorganized it into formal channels where collection, analysis, and diplomatic negotiation were intertwined. The intelligence community's ability to monitor effectively became a strategic asset, shaping bargaining power and influencing the willingness of leaders to enter or extend agreements. This period demonstrated that verification was neither purely cooperative nor purely adversarial, but a hybrid domain in which transparency and concealment operated simultaneously, and where the balance between them defined whether arms control enhanced stability or created new uncertainties within the broader Cold War confrontation. As the mid-1970s progressed into the late 1970s, arms control verification expanded in both scope and complexity, reinforcing its role as a sustained intelligence battleground in which compliance assessment, technical innovation, and strategic suspicion operated simultaneously. Agreements limiting strategic delivery systems and constraining defensive deployments required continuous observation of dispersed missile fields, production plants, testing ranges, and naval facilities, compelling intelligence agencies to integrate imagery analysis, telemetry monitoring, electronic interception, and human reporting into unified compliance frameworks. Analysts developed detailed baseline inventories of adversary forces, against which subsequent imagery and declared data exchanges were compared, transforming verification into a longitudinal analytic exercise rather than a one-time inspection event. Data exchanges mandated under agreements provided structured information. Yet intelligence services approach these disclosures with disciplined skepticism, cross-referencing declared figures against independent collection to detect inconsistencies or patterns suggesting concealment. Telemetry analysis remained a focal point, as missile test data revealed performance characteristics central to assessing modernization trajectories, and disputes over encryption or signal masking were interpreted not only as technical disagreements, but as indicators of strategic intent. On-site inspection provisions, where negotiated, were executed under tightly regulated protocols, and intelligence planners prepared inspection teams with exhaustive analytic briefs, anticipating potential concealment strategies and prioritizing observations within limited time windows. Inspection results were folded into broader analytic assessments that considered facility layout, production tempo, transportation, patterns, and supporting infrastructure, reinforcing the principle that compliance judgment required cumulative evidence. Deception concerns intensified as both sides explored legal avenues to restructure forces within treaty ceilings, prompting intelligence agencies to monitor parallel research programs and emerging technologies that might enable circumvention without overt violation. Verification debates increasingly centered on definitional precision, as seemingly technical disputes over what constituted a launcher, a test article, or a modernization step carried significant strategic consequences, underscoring how language itself became a site of intelligence contest. Consultative commissions established under treaties provided forums for addressing compliance concerns. Yet, these diplomatic mechanisms often served as extensions of intelligence maneuvering, where states presented evidence selectively and probed the adversary's confidence in its own assessments. Political leaders depended on intelligence reports to evaluate the durability of agreements, making analytic rigor essential not only for national security, but for sustaining domestic support for arms control. Internal intelligence deliberations emphasized probabilistic language, acknowledging that incomplete data and adversary concealment could rarely yield absolute certainty, and resisting pressures to frame ambiguous findings as definitive proof. Technological advances in satellite resolution and signal processing enhanced monitoring capabilities, yet they also revealed the limits of remote observation, reinforcing the need for integrated multi-source analysis. Arms control verification thus evolved into a dynamic interplay between technological innovation and strategic adaptation, as improvements in monitoring prompted countermeasures, which in turn generated new analytic challenges. Intelligence agencies recognized that verification effectiveness depended not solely on access or equipment, but on institutional discipline in weighing evidence, avoiding mirror imaging assumptions, and distinguishing between plausible modernization and treaty violation. By the late 1970s, verification had become a permanent and specialized intelligence function, embedded within bureaucratic structures and supported by dedicated analytic teams whose assessments influenced negotiation strategy and defense planning alike. This institutionalization reflected an enduring Cold War reality that arms control did not eliminate rivalry, but redirected it into technical, procedural, and evidentiary arenas where advantage depended on analytic precision rather than battlefield maneuver. The verification battlefield was therefore defined less by dramatic confrontation than by continuous scrutiny, incremental discovery, and calibrated diplomatic response, ensuring that arms control remained inseparable from intelligence competition, even as it sought to constrain the instruments of war. As the late 1970s moved into the early 1980s, arms control verification entered a period marked by heightened strategic tension and accelerated modernization programs, conditions that intensified its character as an intelligence battlefield, where compliance judgments carried both diplomatic and military consequences. The expansion of strategic arsenals and the introduction of more advanced delivery systems required intelligence agencies to refine counting methodologies, reassess baselines, and account for qualitative improvements that might alter deterrence balance even within numerical ceilings. Analysts face the challenge of distinguishing legitimate modernization permitted under treaty frameworks from activities that edge toward circumvention, a distinction that depended on careful interpretation of imagery, telemetry, and production indicators rather than explicit admission. Disputes over telemetry encryption during missile tests became emblematic of this contest, as one side viewed encryption as protective of sensitive design information, while the other regarded it as an obstacle to verification confidence, transforming technical signal processing into a matter of strategic trust. Satellite reconnaissance capabilities improved markedly during this period, enabling more precise observation of silo construction, mobile launcher deployment, and naval activity. Yet even enhanced resolution could not eliminate ambiguity regarding internal facility use or future deployment intent, reinforcing the principle that incomplete data persisted despite technological progress. On-site inspections, where negotiated, remained highly choreographed, and intelligence services trained inspectors to detect subtle indicators such as recent ground disturbance, equipment placement patterns, and inconsistencies in declared inventories, folding these observations into broader analytic frameworks. Compliance assessment reports increasingly incorporated probabilistic language, reflecting institutional recognition that arms control judgments rarely rested on single decisive pieces of evidence, but on cumulative weight of indicators. Political leadership relied on these assessments to navigate domestic debate over treaty ratification and implementation, making analytic credibility central to sustaining policy. Consultative mechanisms established under agreements were used to present evidence and contest interpretations, effectively institutionalizing intelligence dialogue under diplomatic auspices. Yet these forums also revealed the limits of transparency, as states guarded sensitive collection sources while pressing allegations selectively. Intelligence agencies therefore balanced the need to protect collection methods with the requirement to substantiate compliance claims, a tension that reinforced the hybrid nature of verification as both cooperative and adversarial. Technological countermeasures, including concealment techniques and infrastructure restructuring, were monitored closely for their potential to obscure treaty-limited items, prompting intelligence analysts to examine secondary indicators such as logistics throughput, industrial output, and training patterns to detect anomalies. Verification expanded beyond static counting to include behavioral analysis, evaluating whether testing tempo, deployment cycles, and maintenance practices aligned with declared force levels. This behavioral dimension underscored that compliance was as much about pattern consistency as about inventory totals. Intelligence communities invested in long-term archival comparison, maintaining detailed records of imagery and telemetry across years to detect gradual divergence that might escape immediate notice. Internal analytic debates were common, as differing interpretations of ambiguous data required structured adjudication to avoid politicization, reinforcing the professional norms of evidence-based judgment. By the early 1980s, arms control verification had become a permanent and technically demanding intelligence mission, supported by specialized analytic cadres and advanced collection systems. Its battlefield character derived not from overt confrontation, but from the persistent effort by each side to maximize informational advantage while minimizing exposure, ensuring that every treaty clause, inspection protocol, and data exchange was scrutinized for strategic implication. This phase demonstrated that arms control did not suspend rivalry, but reorganized it into procedural arenas where the contest centered on interpretation, detection thresholds, and evidentiary standards, embedding intelligence competition at the heart of efforts ostensibly designed to reduce the instruments of war. As the early to mid-1980s unfolded, arms control verification operated within an environment of both intensified strategic competition and renewed diplomatic engagement, reinforcing its role as a central intelligence battleground where technological innovation, legal precision, and analytic discipline intersected. Negotiations addressing intermediate range systems, strategic reductions, and testing limitations required verification mechanisms that extended beyond static counting to encompass dynamic monitoring of mobility, dismantlement procedures, and production cessation, compelling intelligence agencies to refine methodologies for tracking not only what existed, but what had been eliminated. Dismantlement verification introduced unique challenges, as inspectors and analysts needed to confirm that declared systems were irreversibly destroyed rather than stored, reconfigured, or repurposed, prompting development of tagging procedures, perimeter monitoring, and structured observation of destruction events. Intelligence services integrated satellite imagery with on-site inspection reports to ensure that dismantlement claims aligned with observable facility changes, reinforcing multi-source corroboration as a foundational principle. Telemetry. Disputes persisted, with encryption practices scrutinized carefully to determine whether data masking concealed prohibited capabilities, and signal analysts devoted extensive resources to interpreting partial streams within the boundaries of agreed transparency. The institutionalization of continuous monitoring regimes, including portal monitoring and perimeter observation at designated facilities, formalized intelligence presence within adversary territory under treaty auspices, transforming verification from episodic inspection to sustained observation. This evolution required intelligence agencies to balance the operational advantages of proximity with the diplomatic constraints imposed by agreed inspection conduct, ensuring that treaty compliance activities did not cross into overt espionage beyond negotiated scope. Consultative commissions became more active forums for resolving compliance concerns. Yet these bodies also served as arenas where evidence was weighed selectively, and intelligence confidence levels were tested through diplomatic exchange. Political leaders relied on compliance assessments to justify treaty implementation and to respond to domestic skepticism, making analytic rigor and source protection critical components of policy credibility. Technological advances in sensor resolution, data processing, and signal analysis enhanced verification capability, but they also exposed new ambiguities, as improved observation revealed complexities previously unseen, requiring more nuanced interpretation. Intelligence communities developed increasingly formalized analytic tradecraft standards for treaty monitoring, emphasizing hypothesis testing, red team review, and probabilistic reporting to guard against politicization. The battlefield character of verification during this period was evident in the constant interplay between innovation and countermeasure, as improvements in monitoring prompted concealment strategies that in turn generated new analytic focus. Verification provisions increasingly codified protection for national technical means, acknowledging that satellite and remote sensing would remain indispensable, while also reinforcing that interference with such systems constituted violation. This formal recognition underscored how intelligence capabilities had become embedded within the legal architecture of arms control itself. Compliance debates were often less about overt violation than about interpretation of ambiguous activity, highlighting that verification hinged on evidentiary thresholds rather than absolute proof. Intelligence agencies therefore cultivated long-term data continuity, ensuring that gradual trends in testing frequency, facility modification, or deployment pattern could be detected even when individual indicators remained inconclusive. By the mid-1980s, arms control verification had matured into a highly institutionalized intelligence enterprise, supported by dedicated analytic units, structured reporting channels, and integrated technological infrastructure. Its effectiveness depended not only on collection assets, but on disciplined interpretation, capable of distinguishing permissible modernization from prohibited expansion. This period demonstrated that verification's strength lay in cumulative scrutiny rather than dramatic discovery, and that its battlefield was defined by the continuous contest over information advantage within frameworks ostensibly designed for cooperation. The sustained interaction between negotiation and intelligence reinforced the central Cold War reality that efforts to constrain weapons did not eliminate rivalry, but relocated it into arenas where evidence, language, and monitoring technology became instruments of strategic competition. As the late 1980s approached, arms control verification entered a phase characterized by unprecedented levels of negotiated transparency alongside enduring strategic caution, reinforcing its status as an intelligence battlefield, even as diplomatic rhetoric emphasized cooperation. New agreements introduced more intrusive inspection regimes, expanded data exchanges, and detailed notification requirements, compelling intelligence agencies to adapt their monitoring frameworks to accommodate both increased access and persistent ambiguity. Verification of reductions rather than mere limits required analysts to confirm the dismantlement, destruction, or conversion of complex systems across multiple sites, transforming compliance assessment into a geographically dispersed and technically intricate enterprise. Intelligence services integrated continuous satellite coverage, portal monitoring, telemetry review, and structured inspection reporting into comprehensive compliance databases, allowing longitudinal tracking of declared and observed changes. Yet even with expanded transparency, incomplete data remained inherent, as inspectors could observe only within negotiated parameters and remote. Sensors could infer, but not directly confirm certain internal processes. Analytic discipline therefore remained paramount, with agencies emphasizing corroboration across sources before concluding compliance or raising formal concern. Consultative bodies became more active as forums for addressing interpretive disputes, yet these diplomatic exchanges often reflected underlying intelligence confidence levels, as states gauged how firmly adversaries believed their own evidence. Technological countermeasures and concealment practices did not disappear but evolved, prompting intelligence analysts to monitor secondary indicators such as industrial throughput, training patterns, and logistical flows that might reveal undeclared activity. Political leaders depended on intelligence assessments to navigate domestic debate over treaty ratification and implementation, placing analytic credibility at the center of strategic stability. The protection of national technical means remained codified and politically sensitive, underscoring that remote intelligence capabilities were recognized as indispensable to verification, even within cooperative frameworks. Internal intelligence reviews continued to stress probabilistic reporting and structured challenge processes to prevent bias, acknowledging that confirmation pressure could distort interpretation under conditions of high diplomatic stakes. As strategic confrontation moderated, the battlefield character of verification shifted from overt suspicion toward technical precision, with disputes focusing more on definitional clarity and evidentiary thresholds than on allegations of systemic violation. This evolution reflected decades of institutional learning about the limits of certainty and the necessity of disciplined interpretation. By the end of the Cold War, arms control verification had become an enduring and specialized intelligence mission embedded within bureaucratic structures and supported by advanced collection technologies. Its battlefield nature derived not from hostility alone, but from the persistent effort by each side to maximize informational advantage while constraining exposure within negotiated bounds. The cumulative experience demonstrated that verification's effectiveness depended less on dramatic discovery than on sustained analytic rigor, capable of integrating incomplete data into coherent compliance judgments. As geopolitical rivalry transformed, the architecture of verification remained a testament to the intertwining of diplomacy and intelligence, revealing that even in moments of détente, the contest over information, interpretation, and strategic assurance continued beneath the surface of formal agreement. In the final assessment of how Cold War arms control verification became an intelligence battlefield, the historical record demonstrates that every major agreement carried within it a parallel contest over information, interpretation, and strategic exposure, transforming compliance monitoring into one of the most technically demanding and politically consequential intelligence missions of the era. From early debates over inspection rights and test detection to later regimes involving continuous monitoring and structured data exchanges, verification mechanisms institutionalized surveillance within diplomatic frameworks, embedding intelligence collection into the legal architecture of arms control. States negotiated not only limits on weapons, but boundaries on observation, calibrating access to facilities, telemetry streams, and infrastructure in ways that balanced transparency against vulnerability, ensuring that each provision reflected strategic calculation as much as cooperative intent. Intelligence agencies played central roles in drafting definitions, shaping inspection protocols, analyzing telemetry, interpreting satellite imagery, and constructing longitudinal baselines against which compliance could be measured, making their analytic rigor essential to both deterrence credibility and diplomatic stability. The battlefield character of verification derived from the persistence of incomplete data, as even the most intrusive regimes could not eliminate ambiguity, requiring probabilistic assessment rather than definitive proof and demanding disciplined resistance to politicized interpretation. Technological innovation repeatedly shifted the balance between visibility and concealment, yet each advance generated countermeasures that restored uncertainty, reinforcing the cyclical nature of the contest. Consultative mechanisms provided forums for resolving disputes, but these exchanges often mirrored underlying intelligence confidence, with evidence presented selectively and interpretive thresholds tested through diplomatic negotiation. By the closing years of the Cold War, verification had matured into a permanent intelligence enterprise supported by specialized analytic units, advanced collection systems, and institutionalized review processes designed to guard against bias while protecting sensitive sources. Its success lay not in eliminating rivalry, but in channeling it into procedural arenas where information advantage replaced unchecked suspicion, and where cumulative scrutiny substituted for immediate confrontation. The enduring lesson of this evolution is that arms control did not suspend intelligence competition, but restructured it, transforming espionage into regulated monitoring and embedding adversarial vigilance within cooperative agreements. In this sense, verification became a stabilizing battlefield, one in which disciplined analysis, technical precision, and calibrated transparency preserved deterrence balance while enabling negotiated restraint, illustrating that in the Cold War, the management of weapons was inseparable from the management of information.